Over in Galatians chapter 2, those of you that haven't been with us, we started Galatians, I don't know, maybe a month ago. Time flies when you're having fun. But Judaizing teachers had entered the church there in the churches of Galatia, various congregations, cities represented by that phrase. And if you remember last week where we left off, he says that the false brethren, they came in, the New King James says, by stealth, secretly, cunning, and as was mentioned last week, that's generally the modus operandi of false teachers. They don't get up and announce, hey, I'm a false teacher. Would y'all like to hear what I have to say? No, they're generally, unfortunately, their character is, if you're going to distort the Word of God, there's nothing worse in this world that you can do. Really. Tell me something worse. Tell me something worse that you can do than disobeying or distorting the Word of God. Living in outright rebellion, there's nothing worse. So if that's the respect that you have for God's Word, then it shouldn't be a surprise to us that false teachers are dishonest. They're dishonest with themselves, and which frankly is the most dangerous type of deceit. And of course they're dishonest with other people. But, so they come in through the side door, so to speak, however you want to put it. And these false teachers were endeavoring to teach to these Gentile Christians that you still needed to either observe all or at least parts of the law of Moses in order to be saved, attempting to somehow combine the two systems, failing to realize that the old law, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the book of Galatians, was never intended to last till the end of time. It had a purpose, but a strictly law system cannot save men. It can only do what? Strictly law system. I mean, if I go out here and I break the law, then I am what? I'm guilty, right? I stand condemned. Somebody says, well, I won't, give me what the law demands. No, I don't want what the law demands, right? Yeah, I want something else. Well, I can't get that through just a law system. I can't keep it perfectly. And then once I violate it, then I stand in need of something else. Some other, some salvation, some mercy, some grace. And so, at any rate, they were attempting, this was their false teaching, and so their motive for getting, their method of getting these people to listen to them was then to tear down the one who brought them the gospel originally, which was the Apostle Paul. And to somehow contend that Paul was not a real apostle like those initial ones, the original ones. And he did not have the same authority. He didn't have the same message. Implying, therefore, I guess, that if Peter and James and those others that they perceived to be important men in the church, as we see here in this book, if they were there teaching them, then they would be on their side. I mean, that's the implication. That if those guys were here, you'd find out that what they're saying is different what Paul is saying. And they would support us Judaizing. When in fact they wouldn't. But that's apparently what they were saying. And so they went about trying to discredit Paul. And so Paul spends these first 2 chapters defending his apostleship and his genuineness and his authority. And he does that basically in 4 ways. One, we saw a couple of them in chapter 2. One, he says, look at the way I used to be, right? The way I used to live. How zealous I was for the Jews' religion. And if you know that, and these people did, and they saw, the change in him, they would understand. Paul says, look, it didn't, nobody could have reached me, basically, other than the Lord himself. And then number two, he mentions that he really didn't have an opportunity. I didn't learn this. I didn't get the gospel. I didn't receive it from other men. They didn't teach it to me. I received it by direct revelation from Christ. And to support that position, he says, look, once I was converted, I preached a little bit in Damascus, and then I went out into the wilderness, into Arabia, wherever that was, either the Arabian Peninsula or out in some desert region near Damascus, where I received my revelation. And by the way, I didn't see any of these other guys, these original apostles, for some 3 years after my conversion. It was 3 years later when I went to Jerusalem, and I only spent a couple of weeks there just getting to know Peter. In our modern day language, he would have said, I went to Jerusalem for a couple of weeks to hang out with Peter. That's what he would have said. And that wasn't time. He didn't teach me anything. He didn't add anything to me. And then from there on, I went into Syria and Cilicia, my home area, into Tarsus, where I preached. And the churches of Judea didn't give me anything. They didn't teach me anything. All they knew was, hey, the guy that once persecuted us is now preaching for us. He's now on ours. That's all. So, then we get into chapter 2, and he makes 2 points here in chapter 2. One, his point is that I'm preaching the same thing that the other apostles are preaching, and the reason you know that is because they approved of my message. They gave me the right hand of fellowship. And number 2, he's going to discuss his manner of life. The way I live is consistent with the gospel of Christ. And by the way, Galatians, not only is the way I live consistent with what I teach, but did you know the way I live is more consistent than the way one of your heroes lives? Did you know that? One of your heroes, Peter, see, and Paul's not being mean about it. He's just pointing out that, look, my authority got it just as much as theirs. So we were in chapter 2 after 14 years. Again, he says, then after 14 years. There's some discussion. Some commentators believe that that's an additional 14 years after the 3, so that it would have been 17 years. The Jerusalem conference would have been 17 years after his conversion. Some believe, no, the 14 years is all inclusive. But nevertheless, whichever one it is, he goes up, and the parallel passage, as we mentioned last week, is in Acts chapter, 15? Where he goes up to deal with this issue about circumcision. In other words, tacking on parts of the law of Moses to the gospel of Christ. And so we saw that parallel between the two passages. He said he went up with Barnabas and he took Titus. That's a fact we don't have from Acts. And the other thing we don't have from Acts is, according to Acts, who sent Paul to this conference? According to Acts, it says the brethren sent him out, right, in Acts. Just like they sent him out on his first missionary journey in Acts chapters 13 and 14. But it's interesting when it says the church sent him out on that first missionary journey, him and Barnabas. Who initiated that? Who initiated that first missionary journey? The Holy Spirit did. He said, set aside Paul and Barnabas for the work to which I've called them. And then the church laid their hands on them, whatever, sent them out on their mission, endorsed them on their mission. Same thing here. We get a second fact here that Paul says, I went up by what? Verse 2. Revelation. Now, I went up because I was told to. Now, the church sent me, but it's interesting. He went up with Barnabas. We mentioned this last week. He went up with Barnabas and Titus, but who's the one that went up by revelation? Paul says, I was. I'm the apostle here, by the way. And I communicated to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but he did it privately to those who have reputation, lest by any means I might run or had run in vain. And so we mentioned that. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. So we mentioned that last week. They had this meeting. He gets together with the leaders in the Jerusalem church, Peter, John, and he says James, the half-brother of the Lord. An elder and leader in the church there, and they all get together and they all get on the same page, and they talk and they say, look, we're all preaching the same gospel message. And so when we go into this conference, this meeting, we're all going to be on the same page. And he takes Titus as a test case. Titus is a Gentile, full-blooded Gentile, not like Timothy. Timothy, Paul had certain, and I think this is another charge here that we'll see later in the chapter, that maybe they say, well, aren't you a little inconsistent, Paul? You circumcised Timothy, but you didn't circumcise Titus. What was the difference? The circumcision of Timothy was a voluntary act designed to overcome some cultural issues that they would have had in trying to reach the Jews in whatever area they were in. Whereas Titus was a full-blooded Gentile and could not be compelled to be circumcised as a matter of salvation. That's two big different things. One is a convenience or an expedience, the word I'm looking for. Timothy was circumcised as a matter of expedience. But Titus would not be compelled to be circumcised as a matter of salvation. And of course, it's interesting, that it takes Titus. We mentioned that last week, how that many commentators believe that the failure to mention Titus could be an indication that Titus and Luke were brothers. But we do know from the book of Titus that Titus was a young man of, as we like to, this generation right here would say he's of strong constitution, right? He was tough, obviously, because he sent him to Crete to deal with Cretans, basically. He said, look, I left some stuff. How would you like that? You get a letter from Paul that says, or Paul brings you in and says, look, I just spent some time converting all those folks in Crete, and they got some problems over there, and those people can be a handful. Guess what? I'm sending you to deal. So then he comes in this time and he says, oh, Titus, guess what? We're going to Jerusalem to face a bunch of Jewish Christians who think you ought to be circumcised, and I just kind of want to throw you out there and as an example that, you don't have. Oh, that's great, Paul. I'm looking forward to this trip. And so I can see Titus standing there, and they're all pointing at him. That man needs to be circumcised. So I said, look. He steps back behind Paul and says, take it up with him. It's coming up. I'm just along for the ride. I'm just here. And I jest, but there is some indication, I guess, that this was kind of the reason for taking it. Because he says, look, we all agreed. And when he says, yet not even Titus, who was with me being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Now notice verse 5, to whom we did not yield submission. Well, who's the we? I mean, what's he just done? Pride. Yeah, he's just spoken with these leaders in the Jerusalem church, those who are of reputation, and they've all agreed that we're on the same page about this issue. And so what Paul says is, we all agree. Titus doesn't have to be circumcised. It wasn't just me and Barnabas. It's everybody. All. And of course, he talks about these false teachers. Came in by stealth to do what? What was their purpose? Spy our liberty. And I guess when I read that, it makes me think that, all false teachers, regardless of what their doctrine is, if they convince us to change the gospel in any way, change the message in any way, they whether it has anything to do with the law of Moses or whatever it is, it's going to affect our liberty. Because if we sin in so doing, then we're back in bondage. But Paul says we didn't yield to them. Verse 6, but from those who seem to be something. whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. God shows personal favoritism to no man. He's no respecter of persons, accepteth no man's person. The Greek literally says God does not receive a man's face. And in all three of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew 22, Mark 12, and Luke 20, the Jewish leaders, they feigned some appreciation for Christ, remember, and they came to him and they said what? About the way he viewed other people, what they said. We perceive that you do not. Yeah, regard the person of men. Literally, you don't look on men's faces. What does that mean? Don't look on men's faces. I'm not judging by what? I'm not judging by outward appearance. I'm not judging by position. I'm not judging you by color of your skin or your social status, anything that's on the outside. Back in the Old Testament, that word face often meant presence. And so, again, I'm not judging. God judges by the inward man. He judges the heart, right? So, Paul reiterates that here. It makes no difference to me. God shows no personal favoritism. He doesn't judge by outward appearance. For those who seem to be something added nothing to me. Well, who are those? Who are those that seem to be something? No. Who are the ones that seem to be something? And they were something, by the way. He's not belittling them. Yeah, he's talking about those leaders there. Peter, James, John. And again, we're talking about James, the half-brother of the Lord. What happened to James, the brother of John, early on in the book of Acts? Yeah, he was martyred. He was beheaded by Herod. So when we talk about this James, who's the pillar in the Jerusalem church, we're talking about the same James that wrote the book of James. And so he says, yeah, they did seem to be something. They were something. But they didn't add anything to me. In other words, again, I didn't get my authority from them. I didn't get my message from them. And frankly, he's defending his apostolic independence. But they were united in their stand against these false teachers. But again, whether they had been or not, and Paul's going to show that a little bit later, he still had authority, whatever their rank and standing was. But isn't that the kind of way we are? That kind of human nature to appeal to someone or somebody that we believe to be important or know something, even if it's contrary to the will of God. I mean, you talk to somebody in a denomination many times and you show them the truth, they may say, that's not what my word says. That's not what my preacher says, my pastor says. I'll go ask him. Well, yeah, you can go ask him, but yeah, that's right. That's not what Billy Graham teaches. That's not what so-and-so teaches. Yeah, we do that in the church sometimes, do we not? We might not find prominent brethren sometimes on different positions. And we need to think through these things for ourselves. Not that that's not... And by the way, it's not that that's not important. I mean, I do believe when we're talking about scholarship, talking about studying, I'm going to read things and study people that I respect and believe they got a little bit of knowledge and that something. But that all being said, not everybody's right about everything all the time, no matter how smart they are or how respected they might be. Yeah.
And I want to be careful how I say this. There's some folks who want to be called doctor this and doctor that. I remember a number of years ago, when I was in Jacksonville, North Carolina, our preacher there, we were doing some work at the building, and he came out, and a person came with him, and this person was calling him Dr. so, and I won't call his name because he's deceased now, but doctor this and doctor that. And so afterwards I said, man, what's this doctor business? And he said, well, I'd rather him call the doctor than call me Reverend. Well, that's been a long time ago. And today that is metastasized. Everybody wants to be called doctor, this, that, and the other. And I always think about what the Booker T. Washington said in his little book. And this is the way he put it. It was usually the dumbest one in the cotton field who would say, and I want to be careful how I say this sun is so hot, these roads are so long, why go preach the gospel. And that's
Well,
the way it is.
you know,
Some
the
of these
bottom
fellas
line
can
is-
scarcely read and write, but they want to be called doctor.
Bottom line is, doctor, reverend, I mean, we're not, obviously evangelists, preachers of the gospel shouldn't be using titles that are not scriptural. Is really the bottom line. And there's no authority really for us to, be addressing our evangelist or our preacher that way, whether it's a reverend or pastor or doctor. Now, that being said, I don't have a problem with somebody who's working in a field where his academic credentials are important, being called doctor. I mean, if I go to my medical doctor, I call him what? I call him doctor. If I'm in a college, even a Christian college, I'm going to call my professor or Dr. So-and-so. But I'm not calling them that in a spiritual sense. I'm not using it as a religious title.
Right, you're not conflating the two.
But if I'm going to put it out here on this sign, and then every time I get up here and Mark, gets ready to preach, if he had his doctorate, I wouldn't get up here and say, well, Dr. Reynolds is about to address us. No, I wouldn't do that. If he had his doctorate and he needed to use it in some particular situation where that was important, okay, fine. If I'm writing for instance, if I'm writing articles for Apologetics Press on Christian evidences, and I have a doctorate in cellular biology, well, that's probably important in that field, especially if I'm addressing articles by atheists who also have their doctorates in that field. I don't have a problem with that, but we're not going to be using it as a spiritual or religious title.
We're not
for our
conflating the
preachers.
two,
Yeah.
Greg. That's the point.
So there's a difference between using it as far as,
Yeah.
our job in that kind of field as opposed to a preacher or evangelist using it as some kind of title. What are we talking about? Oh, we were talking about those that seem to be something. The doctors, master's degrees. But on the contrary, when they saw, who's they? Those pillars of the Jerusalem church, saw that the gospel for the uncircumcised, the Gentiles, had been committed to me, as the gospel for the circumcised, the Jews, was to Peter. For he who worked effectively in Peter for the apostleship to the circumcised also worked effectively in me toward the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, and they were, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas what? The right hand of fellowship. We should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They desired only that we should remember the poor, the very thing which I was eager to do. And so, the point he's making, it's not that Paul only taught Gentiles. We know that's not true. What was his practice on missionary journeys? Where's the first place he always went? Synagogue. He went to people that already had some background in knowledge of the true God of heaven. He went to the Jews before he went to the pagans. And he started there. And then he converted who he could. And then when the majority of them rejected him, then he moved on to the rest of that area, the Gentiles. So he preached to Jews. And Peter, while he primarily preached to Jews, he didn't limit himself or confine himself to that. In fact, we know from Acts chapter 10 that Peter converted and preached to the first Gentile converts. So we're talking about in general here, of course, as far as their sphere of work was concerned. But it's interesting how they, he says, when they saw that the gospel had been committed to who? What does he say? Us or me? We or me? Us? Me. Now Paul's the apostle here. Barnabas is an apostle in that general sense of the term, as a messenger of one sent, but not in the technical sense. Only Paul is the apostle here, that ambassador for Christ, who had that special authority. So he said, when they saw that had been committed to me, just like to them, again, notice he says, perceive the grace that had been given to me. Then they gave me and Barnabas, okay, because Barnabas is part of my group, he's in my party, the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles and they the circumcised. So they give me the right hand of fellowship, they endorse my message, and not only that, but we all agree on the plan. We all agree on, kind of an evangelistic plan. Y'all are going to go this direction, and we're going to go that direction. We're working together. That's what fellowship means. What is the basic? Give me a one-word synonym for fellowship. Yeah, sharing. Partnership. A sharing. So we're in fellowship. And we have a partnership here, and they're going to do this, and I'm going to do that. And we all agreed on that. So I was endorsed. My message was endorsed. We're preaching the same thing. But we also understand that because of this controversy, because of these false teachers who basically seem to be saying, you could look at it this way. These false teachers are saying, look, you're a traitor, Paul. A traitor to who? You've abandoned your own what? Your own people. You've abandoned your own people. You turned your back on your own people. So, in order to demonstrate in your personal life that you haven't turned your back on your own people, we want you to do what? Remember who? The poor. And generally speaking, when they were giving relief for the poor, they were generally talking about Jewish Christians who were left in Judea, right? And so, we want everybody to understand that you haven't totally cut yourself off from your own people, from a physical perspective, from the Jewish Christians. So while you're out and about, make sure you remember that you haven't alienated yourself. And one easy way to do that is through benevolence. Right? We sometimes talk about that. What's the easiest way to get someone to listen to you? They don't want to listen to what you have to say until they know that you do what? Yeah, that you care about them. And so part of the reason, when you really get down to the church's mission, we sometimes break it down into, evangelism and what else? Benevolence, and what's the third one? Edification. Sometimes we break it down. But when it gets down to it, all of those areas actually end up being for what purpose? Really, you've got to save souls and to glorify God. You've got evangelism, obviously, that's easy to see. But edification is to build up the body of Christ, strengthen Christians, help them to grow so that they remain faithful, glorify God in their daily walk and activities, make sure they make it to heaven. But in your benevolence, you're actually able to both Christians and non-Christians show your love, concern, and your care. And by doing that, again, you'll have an opportunity to save some souls. So, Paul, you need to do that. And Paul said, yeah. Paul said, I know I need to do that. I just kind of I'm thinking, Paul said, yeah, you don't tell me that. But he said, no, we all agreed. Yeah, I was more than eager. He said, I was eager to do that. They made that suggestion, and I was eager to do it. It makes sense to me. And so now we get to this fourth argument, if I guess more or less, that Paul makes regarding his authority and his genuineness as an apostle of Christ. And that is his public rebuke of another apostle. This is kind of a fascinating study, really. But let's begin in verse 11. Now when Peter had come to Antioch, that's Antioch what? No, not Pisidia. Of Syria. Right, Syria. Where Paul's missionary journeys, that's where he staged his mission work from. That great Gentile church in Antioch. Now when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face, because he was to be blamed. The New King James says, I think the King James says what? Does it say blamed? What's the American Standard?
King James says
Stood
blame.
condemned, which is probably, in this case, a better rendering. Because sometimes blame may not have the force of the Greek word there, but commentators believe that the rendering condemned is really more accurate in assessing the seriousness and the gravity of what Peter had done and the example he was leading these people down this road. He said he was to be blamed. He stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played. King James says uses the word dissimulation, but in the end, that Greek word, I think it's translated here nicely in the New King James. He played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. That's an interesting thing that mentioned James. There's some discussion in commentators about James's role in this. Most take this was after the Jerusalem conference. So we know that in Jerusalem, James did what? When they were in the conference, he sided with the truth. And he said, well, here, let's write this letter and, we'll send it out. So it seems that most commentators take the position that, James was obviously well respected among Jewish Christians. And so whether or not he took this position, they would just kind of throw his name out there, as their authority. Well, James were, in other words, the implication is, if James were here, here's what James would do. Well, don't we know what James would do from Acts chapter 15? Although I've heard a few others say, well, James might have, who knows, maybe James was Lord. But I don't know. The Holy Spirit inspired James to write the book again. So I think James would have been on the side of truth, no matter how proud he might have been of his own heritage. Nothing wrong with that. But they're throwing out James's name. So when these guys come from James, who are obviously Jewish persuasion, Peter gets intimidated, I guess, in some way. He feels intimidated, a little peer pressure, doesn't want to appear a certain way in front of them. And really, let's think about it. We mentioned in the last maybe last week or the week before, when Paul was converted, it changed his heart, it changed his behavior, but it didn't change his personality, right? Paul says, look, before I was a Christian, I was 110% kind of guy. I gave Judaism my all, and I ran well ahead of everybody else that was in my age group. Anybody that was in Gamaliel school, I was the first grader. I was number one. I was the summa cum laude of that school. Valedictorian. And he didn't change when he became a Christian. He was just as energetic and zealous and hard-charging as ever. And here we see Peter doing, unfortunately, sometimes what Peter does. Have we seen this before? couple of times? When's the first time we see this with Peter? His waffling. Huh? Yeah, even before that, though. Even before that. Yeah, we see it in the denial. Walking on the water. Remember that? And I guess that's why so many of us can identify with Peter. Because he's a guy that wants to do right. There's no question about Peter's intention. And where his heart is and where his allegiance is. And yet, sometimes in life, we let peer pressure and we let intimidation and we let fear get the best of us. And we don't speak up when we should have, or we sit quiet or whatever. And we do things we shouldn't. Impulsively and on the spur of the moment. Not because we had some intention going in saying, oh, I think I'll deny the Lord today. I'm going to get up this morning. Well, I think I'll be a hypocrite today. Well, no, we don't. That's not what Peter did. That's not generally what we do. So we can identify with that.
Brother Greg, in the secular world, this is a real issue. Leave it there.
And so apparently he's eating with the Gentiles, and then these come, and then he pulls away from the Gentiles, because remember, Jews, Gentiles were what? The Jews. From a religious perspective, though, they were unclean. They were not going to eat with Gentiles. So Peter won't eat with them. And he's a hypocrite in really a couple of ways. In one way, he was not acting this way before. And so he's trying to portray that, this is me all the time. Well, it's not you all the time. You didn't have a problem with the Gentiles before they came. Which also begs the question. Last couple of minutes here, we'll get off the subject. Not really off the subject. But it's still, these kinds of passages bother me with the increasing way people teach the operation of the Holy Spirit. That all Christians have some kind of this non-miraculous measure that's supposed to do what? And it's supposed to strengthen me and help me live the Christian life. Well, now wait a minute. This guy, Peter, was what? An apostle who was baptized in the Holy Spirit. You couldn't be any more filled with the Holy Spirit than an apostle of Christ. As that term is used, in effect, he was given power. The Holy Spirit wasn't literally living inside of him. Brother Wood used to say, chopped up little pieces and distributed them. So, no more than Christ or God is when the Bible says that they dwell in us. And they're all three members of God. And yet, here's Peter, who obviously sins on this occasion. Paul said he stood condemned. Well, where was the, quote, non-miraculous measure? We know he's baptized in the Holy Spirit, but where's that non-miraculous measure that's supposed to help him just live the Christian life? Where's that at? And if it's there and it didn't help him, well, then whose fault was it? Why wouldn't it be the Holy Spirit's fault? Why is it my fault that I'm messing up? Because he only dwells in me to the extent that what? The Word of God dwells in me, and it is my desire and intent to keep it in obedience. This is just another one of those passages that I just can't quite consistently understand or come to grips with in light of that kind of teaching.
I understand this situation. It's not that Peter would not sit at the same table with Gentiles in a meeting place and somebody told him, but he separated himself from nothing.
It wouldn't have anything to do with it. But they're brothers in Christ. And he didn't have any problem with it before the other people got there. So again, it's a matter of, this is a situation of peer pressure, of intimidation that happens to everybody. But the fact that it happened to him and yet to deal with it tells me a little something, the way God operates. It also helps me a little bit, too, in my own daily walk with Christ. Okay, well, we'll pick up here with Paul's speech to Peter. And that's interesting, too, because there's a difference of opinion as to whether his speech is one verse or whether it goes to the end of the chapter. It might go to the end of the chapter. It doesn't really matter. Part of it's his explanation. Okay, we'll pick up there next week.